Studios, Shelina Janmohamed, author of Love in a Headscarf and Generation M. And from our Oxford studio, Douglas Murray, Associate Editor of The Spectator.
The anchorman introduced Shelina Janmohamed as one of the discussants on the episode of BBC's Newsnight. If you didn't catch it, she's the author of Love is a Headscarf and Generation M. And that point is important because it would seem the discussion to be had revolved around what is called a Burkini. It is essentially a bikini for Muslim women, more like a head-to-heel diver suit.
Coming in, Shelina, you apparently have a Burkini.
I do. It's an open secret. I've got one. It just looks like a long t-shirt with a pair of leggings and a swimming cap on top.
Did you know it was going to be such an important statement of any kind when you acquired it?
It looks like a wetsuit that people up and down the country wear, which we need in British waters because it's pretty cold, or you need out in the south of France because it's really hot.
Shelina was quite proud of the fact that she owned a Burkini too. And a crude form of it included a mere t-shirt, leggings, and a cap. And the trend, if you could call it that, had gone viral, particularly in France. Mind you, this was 2017. And moreover, Shelina couldn't help but joke at how practical it was when it came to the weather.
I mean, in the last 18 months, more than 200 people have been killed in jihadist attacks in France.
As usual, Douglas Murray was on hand via video call to put a dampener on what all the hype about Burkinis was, anyway. He had in fact written recently about it, more or less calling it a distraction from what was really happening with Islam. There had been recent terrorist attacks in France and Germany. So naturally, Douglas wasn't finding it funny.
Bikini is a frivolous debate to be having. Not one life is likely to be saved.
Douglas straight out calls it a frivolous issue. Apparently, a Muslim woman had hit the beach in France wearing one, and she had been harassed for it. Again, Douglas blamed it on German and French politicians for trivializing the problem that radical Islam represented. But in reality, burkinis and terrorism were worlds apart. So what really is Douglas's beef?
Do need to take a moment just to step back and imagine for women all around the country and all around the world what it's like to sit on a beach building sandcastles with your children and have 4 policemen stand around you with handguns and make you take your top off. I think everybody really needs to let that sink in. That is quite serious.
For clarity, Douglas was really saying there is a real and pressing existential war between Islam and the West, and European leaders would do well to take it more seriously. But Shelina had this to say, which it came down to religious tolerance. The woman at the beach in question had been told by 4 armed policemen to take off her top, simply because her dress code didn't suit the occasion.
When we have a state and we have police telling women what they can and cannot wear, then we are into very dangerous territory. And I'll tell you which other organisations tell women what to and what not to wear at the barrel of a gun, and that is Daesh and the extremists.
Shelina did not compare the confrontation to cases within ISIS, enclaves where women were forced to dress a certain way at gunpoint. So in this instance, which just so happened in so-called civilized society, it seemed the protector had turned to become the oppressor.
He's actually had quite a lot to say about this because Cannes was the first city. He said, when I took the decision to ban people from walking topless in the streets of Cannes, nobody said a thing about human rights. Apparently he did stop people walking topless.
He probably didn't also say that women who wanted to go for a swim were somehow pledging allegiance to a terrorist organisation.
Yeah, that was his other quote.
Even the mayor of Cannes had a thing or two to say about the whole incident. Apparently, there was a time when people would walk the street topless in the town and at the beach. So, the mayor promptly prohibited it. And back then, nobody complained of human rights, nor were Muslim women prevented from visiting the beach for the wrong dress code.
The better approach to the problem which you think exists, the French approach that Sarkozy is promoting, or the Anglo-Saxon approach that President Sarkozy now says he doesn't think is right because it means we ignore each other, we tolerate each other but ignore each other.
The discussion swung back to Douglas now. The anchorman did cite 2 theoretical solutions that were already out there to deal with the now public debate. Sarkozy had some ideas about how to handle the embarrassment that largely involved tolerance. But there was also the snubby Anglo-Saxon way, which the anchorman alluded to, and to which Sarkozy was kicking against.
Of course, the parallel that's just been drawn breaks down, doesn't it, when we remember that the French authorities, grotesque as this, I think we are in agreement, is, do not then do to the women what ISIS and the Taliban do, which is to rape them and kill them. So it's a parallel that goes a certain way, but we have to keep this in some context.
But Douglas couldn't move on from the parallel Shelina drew between women in ISIS-controlled areas and Muslim women in civilized countries. He sort of painted a picture of how women in terrorist zones had it worse, however you looked at it. To be fair to him, he was arguing for shock effect so as to make what the beach cops did less serious in comparison.
And the fact is now is that everybody realizes that none of the models have worked. None of them have worked. They've all broken down. None of them were any good. None of them were fit for purpose.
But then finally, he had to address the question of methodology the anchorman posed to him. As Douglas put it, there have been many models of dealing with the issue of Muslim radicalization over the years. But clearly none of them have worked. Douglas then took his argument further.
Suburbs of Paris, because if he did go to them, he would see that precisely that parallel existence exists in France. I would argue worse than any other European country. But it's not really a question of who's done it really well and who's done it really badly.
Douglas now dared to put Sarkozy on the spot and begged of him to visit certain suburbs in France. And he would come to find that the same methodology of tolerating but ignoring one another, which Sarkozy shunned, was also a part of the French reality. Finally, Douglas had to admit that the integration experiment had failed, whether it was with Sarkozy's ideology of inclusion or Chancellor Merkel's generosity.
The problem is when we try and stitch together ideas around immigration and what women should and shouldn't wear and the idea there's some kind of security and terrorism problem, then we are approaching the issue the wrong way. That's how we end up with policemen telling women to take their clothes off.
Shelina was asked the same question. What sort of model did she think would work for the integration, or better yet, accommodation of Muslim values within the broader context of highly secularized Western societies? And Shelina straightaway faulted the ongoing approach because it was trying to solve the problem from the outside. Policymakers across stitching ideas together and generalizing.
Force the rule of law to allow the citizens to flourish. And that has to be by allowing people to express their values and to participate in society. And if Muslim women want to do that by the way they dress, but actually being part of the public society, then we have to allow them to express that. That is the fundamental of why we live in a liberal democracy.
Her idea was for governments across Europe to look more closely at the rule of law as it related to diversity. And whatever the case, you didn't want to intimidate people from participating in society. Instead, you wanted them to flourish and to be able to express themselves how best they deemed fit without persecution. And wasn't that the point of living in a liberal democracy? So for Shelina, it came down to the appearance of the rule of law, safeguarding personal and cultural values. We would like to know your thoughts on this. Do you think the French Burkini incident deserved the spotlight it inevitably got? Tell us about your ideas in the comments section below.